The question of the GOAT, or the greatest of all time, is one of the most crucial debates of our generation. It's been brought to anime, it's been brought to video games, and it's been brought to sports. The greatest of all time is something that needs to be brought to Yu-Gi-Oh! With over 12,000 unique cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Between the OCG and the TCG, it's something that really hasn't been discussed all that much, with the exception of a few articles, of course, on the internet that claim that Slifer and Dark Magician are the greatest cards ever, from people who haven't played the game in 15 plus years. But today we are going to be looking at all of the cards that have a legitimate claim to be called the greatest Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards of all time. Alright, so first up we have to start with cards that are available in the game today. These are cards that have survived years of power creep and generally are some of the newest cards, so of course you would think that they would be some of the more powerful cards available in the game. Power creep is a huge part of Yu-Gi-Oh! There are a lot of cards like, for example, Raigeki and Mirror Force, two cards that used to be the undisputed GOATs of Yu-Gi-Oh! They were the best spell card and the best trap card. You ran it in every deck you could, and when they hit the ban list, they didn't come back for years. But because of modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Being so fixated around going first, making Raigeki a lot less strong, modern monster boards in Yu-Gi-Oh! Have so much destruction protection that cards like Raigeki virtually don't do anything. You either are playing through a ton of negates, or you're playing through a bunch of destruction protection. Things like Raigeki do absolutely nothing against modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Boards. Also, both of these cards received major upgrades. Raigeki got Lightning Storm, and Mirror Force got a collection of different Mirror Force cards, and neither of those are strong enough to be considered the GOAT Yu-Gi-Oh! Card either. So we're going to have to look at some of the more modern cards that actually are played in every single deck. Now, you can't talk about powerful modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards without talking about hand traps. Hand traps are the only cards, perhaps the only cards in the game, that not only survive power creep, but actually benefited from power creep. They became stronger as time went on. Cards like Droll and Lockbird, for example, almost never saw meta play, and now it's almost always a staple side deck card. Now, to start our list, we have Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. This is one of the most powerful cards in the game, and again, hand traps are really important because they can prevent your opponent from setting up their big and unbreakable board. It can stop your opponent from comboing, and this is where Yu-Gi-Oh! Has taken a turn. It's not as good to have a Raigeki as it is to just stop your opponent from searching once, because if they can't search, they can't combo, and they can't continue into the rest of their game. So to start off, Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring has three distinct effects, or it can stop one of three different things, but it is once per turn. Number one, you can stop your opponent from summoning a monster from the deck, which can stop a variety of different combos. It can stop your opponent from special summoning from the deck. It can stop your opponent from searching from the deck, which can stop things like Tenki and other search cards. And then, of course, it can stop your opponent from sending a card from their deck to the graveyard, which again can start up their combo. The reason Ash Blossom is so powerful is it can deal with a lot of combo starters in the game, and it can help you make your opponent go minus. So if they activate a card like Trade-In, pitching a level 8, and then you Ash it, they've just gone minus, and they can't draw, and now they have much less cards to play with during their turn. And what's important about hand traps is hand traps are able to be activated during either player's turn. They're not like traditional traps, which have to be set and then wait. So Ash Blossom is one of the cards that should be considered one of the greatest cards of all time. Next up, we've got Infinite Impermanence. Ash and Impermanence are probably the two staple hand traps in the game. Impermanence is very powerful because it can, during either player's turn, negate a monster on the field. Target and negate a monster on the field. This is again very important when your opponent's trying to set up some sort of a combo. They normal summon, activate, for example, an Armageddon Knight. You hit them with an Impermanence and their turn could very well be over. This is especially powerful against cards like Crystron, Heckler Fibrax. It's very powerful against things like Isolde. Any of the Link 2 or just really important choke points in their deck, if you hit them with a hand trap like an Impermanence, is very powerful. Also, Impermanence power creeps almost every single other negating hand trap like Effect Veiler and Ghost Mourner. It basically power creeps all of them because it is not only a trap card, so it can't be hit by Call by the Grave, but in addition to that, it actually negates the entire column. If it was set that turn, you can negate the entire column and all the spawn trap cards that are activated in that column for the rest of that turn. So you can actually negate spell and trap cards in the right situations. So if your opponent already has a monster and then you chain a infinite impermanence to in a column where they're activating a spell card, you can actually negate that spell card. You can negate trap cards, you can negate floodgates. It's actually really versatile in terms of what this card can do, and it's another card that without a doubt would be played in almost any era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Our next card is Forbidden Droplets. Now remember how I said a few seconds ago that Raigeki just wasn't strong enough for the modern game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Forbidden Droplets is actually the complete opposite. It is an extremely versatile card that you can use going first or going second. What Forbidden Droplets basically allows you to do is send cards from your hand to the graveyard and then negate monsters on your opponent's side of the field equal to the amount of cards that you send. And then on top of that, your opponent cannot respond with the type of cards that you send to the graveyard. So if you send trap cards, your opponent can't respond with trap cards. If you send spell cards, your opponent can't respond with spells. And if you send monster cards, your opponent cannot respond with monster cards. So their entire board is negated, and they can't even negate that card. Also, this card doesn't target, so it can play around cards that have targeting protection and destruction protection, and you can still basically negate them. It's extremely versatile going second. And then going first, of course, you can just set this card. It is a quick play after all. You can set it in your back row, wait for your opponent to do something, activate Forbidden Droplets, send something you don't need from your hand or face up on the field to the graveyard, and then afterwards you are able to negate your opponent's card as an interruption. So it's good going first and it's good going second. This is the type of card that power creeps Raigeki and makes it so you just don't have a reason to play a Raigeki unless you're playing a very strong going second strategy. This is easily Forbidden Droplets, one of the most powerful cards of all time. It's the reason why it's probably the most expensive card on this list today. It is an extremely versatile card. It would be played in any era, and it's definitely deserving to be on this list. Next up is Pot of Prosperity. Now there is another pot card that is coming up in this list later on that should be considered, but this is the only pot that actually eclipsed Pot of Greed, or possibly eclipsed Pot of Greed. It is not exactly the same. It's not just Pot of Greed with an additional cost like Pot of Extravagance or Pot of Desires. It is actually in certain ways better than Pot of Greed. What Pot of Prosperity actually allows you to do is to banish 6 cards from your extra deck. You get to choose, so it's not random and you don't have to hinder yourself. You just have to reduce the amount of cards that you can later go into in your duel. But you banish between 3 and 6 cards. If you banish 3, you get to look at the top 3 cards of your deck. And if you banish 6, you get to look at the top 6 cards of your deck. Now the reason that this card is so powerful, even though it only adds 1 card, whereas Pot of Greed lets you draw 2 cards, is because it lets you dig 6 cards deep into your deck. This is extremely important in the modern game of Yu-Gi-Oh! So just to do a quick example, you start with 5 cards in your hand, you activate Pot of Prosperity, and you get to look at the top 6 cards of your deck. So now you've basically looked 11 cards deep into your deck. You are very bound to see one of your important combo starters in all of those 11 cards, especially if you play a 40 card deck. It's extremely good for consistency in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! It does lock you out of drawing for the rest of the turn, but most modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks have actually totally cut all draw cards, because getting random cards to your hand is a lot less important than seeing your combo pieces and being able to search the things that you actually need to build a board or to break a board. So that's why Pot of Prosperity definitely deserves to be on this list. Now those were all of the modern cards that deserve to be looked at as the greatest cards of all time. But for the rest of this video, we're going to dust off the Forbidden and Limited list and look into some of the older cards that, if they came back today, would absolutely terrorize the metagame. So right off the bat, we have to rule a couple out. Delinquent Duo, Confiscation, and Forceful Sentry are all amazing cards. Fantastic cards, but they are totally worthless going second. If you lose that dice roll and you're forced to use these cards, they are pointless. They do almost nothing for you going second, because essentially all they do is take cards out of your opponent's hand. By that time, your opponent will have spit everything out onto the board, and the only thing you'd possibly be able to take out of their hands are hand traps that they saved to use against you later. That would be the only real advantage to play these cards. Other than that, they just wouldn't be quite as good. They are easy answers, but unfortunately they are not quality enough to be considered the greatest cards of all time. Now first up, we've got Pot of Greed. This is an easy one. I don't think anyone could really argue that Pot of Greed doesn't deserve to be in discussion about the most powerful cards of all time. This card could easily be the greatest card of all time. It lets you, quite simply, draw 2 cards. Now that doesn't seem like much, but there is no cost to that, and it's an absolutely free +1. It lets you get deeper into your deck. It lets you go +1, so even if you start with 5 cards, you essentially start with 6 cards. And on top of that, a deck thins by 2 cards. This card would be played in every single deck in the modern game. There isn't a single deck that would not play Pot of Greed. It is just that good, and it's easily one of the cards that can be considered one of the greatest cards of all time. Next up, we've got Graceful Charity. Pot of Greed, as good as it is, doesn't do any combo setup. It just lets you draw 2 cards. But Graceful Charity lets you draw 3 cards deep into your deck, which again lets you see more combo pieces, whatever you need, and on top of that, it discards 2 cards. Yu-Gi-Oh has taken a massive turn in the last, I'd say, 15 years, where the graveyard just has become more and more and more important. There was a time in old 2003 vanilla Yu-Gi-Oh where sending cards to the graveyard was actually a pretty big drawback and a pretty big cost. You didn't want to send your Gemini Elf to the graveyard. You wanted to keep stuff like that in your hand, but in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, everything has a graveyard effect. So a card like Graceful Charity that lets you draw 3 cards and then discard 2 cards, and it's not a cost, by the way. So if your opponent does ash this card, you don't have to get rid of anything. The card just goes to the graveyard. You get to draw 3 cards and then discard 2 cards. So decks like Phantom Knights, decks like Orcust, decks that thrive on playing in the graveyard, they would love a card like Graceful Charity. It would essentially be a combo starter every single time for them, because they would be able to get 3 deep into their deck, discard 2, and then use both of those effects immediately. This card would be absolutely broken, and it can easily be considered the greatest card of all time just because of what it allows you to do. It's both a combo starter and a draw card, and there's virtually no real cost to this. It's just simply a very, very strong card. Next up, we've got one of the most controversial Yu-Gi-Oh cards of all time. It is an absolutely meta-warping, meta-destroying, in some people's opinion, card. And that card is Maxi. Now, I didn't finish talking about all of the hand traps, because this one is quite possibly the most powerful. It is banned in the TCG, and almost nobody wants it back. And in the OCG, it's at 3. And they've been playing with it at 3 for years. It's also at 3 in Master Duel. It is absolutely a meta-warping card. If you've ever played in the higher ranks of Master Duel, you would know, because everybody plays about 5 to 6 different cards just to out this card, because it is that frustrating to play through. So what this card basically does is every single time after you activate this card, every single time your opponent special summons, you get to draw a card. There is no limit to the amount of cards that you draw. You just draw as many times as they summon. This is the type of card that makes your opponent end their turn, because if they have to keep playing through it, they will just simply give you too many cards, and they will get OTK'd the following turn. So you always have to play this balancing game where you have to ask yourself, do I keep playing and build my board and possibly get OTK'd, or do I just pass on a very terrible board and just get OTK'd anyways? It's a very, very frustrating card to play through. You do have to play a bunch of different outs to make sure that Maxi doesn't prevent you from playing the game. Things like, for example, Crossout Designator, Call by the Grave. I've seen people play Psy-Frames just because it's that frustrating to deal with the Maxi. Ash Blossom stops Maxi. As a matter of fact, Ash Blossom stops almost every other card on this list. So that's why that card gets to be in this discussion. But Maxi is a totally meta-warping card. You have to play all of the counters to it. You have to play all of the outs. And if you don't, you basically lose. And that's why it definitely deserves to be on this list. The next card is Painful Choice. Now, this card has been banned for so long that no one has even fathomed the insane types of boards and combos that you can do with Painful Choice. What this card basically allows you to do is to select 5 cards from your deck. Your opponent looks at those 5 cards and then picks one of them, adds that card to your hand. The rest of the cards are discarded to the graveyard. This effect is absolutely insane. It may not seem like that much because you're only getting 1 card, but the reality is there are so many different directions that you can take this card. Not only can you take this in so many different directions, every single deck would play it. You can just reveal 5 different hand traps to your opponent, and then your opponent picks one of them. And just right away, you get to add a hand trap to your hand, and then the other 4 cards go to the graveyard. And basically, you don't have to worry about drawing those hand traps later in the duel again. That is already a really good effect. The second part of this effect that's absolutely insane is that it deck thins your deck by basically 5 cards. You activate it, and now your deck is now a 30-card deck. You started with a 40-card deck, you drew 5 cards for a turn, you activated this, you got rid of 5 more cards in your deck. So now your deck is only 30 cards. So any draw card you now activate, you get to make sure that you don't draw the 5 cards that you got rid of in that deck. Next, what is absolutely insane about this card is that you can pick 5 cards with amazing graveyard effects, stuff like Dandelion, stuff like just amazing graveyard effects in general, Jet Synchron, a Glow Up Bulb. You can pick a bunch of cards with insane graveyard effects, the Phantom Knights. Pick all of those cards, your opponent picks one of them, and it really doesn't matter what they pick, because the second those cards hit the graveyard, you have 4 simultaneous activations going off, making you go +4, +5, +6, +7. 1 card can probably get you to 5 different monsters and a multitude of searches. And of course, with Yu-Gi-Oh, everything compounds, and you build these giant, amazing boards off of just a few graveyard effects. This card absolutely cannot come back to the game. It is easily up there in terms of the most powerful cards of the game, because it doesn't just plus you a little bit, it does 5 different amazing things. And then on top of that, there are so many different versatile strategies that you can do with Painful Choice. It's easily one of the greatest cards of all time. Next, we've got Dimensional Fusion. Now, if the graveyard in Yu-Gi-Oh has become a second hand, the banish pile is like a second graveyard. See, back in old Yu-Gi-Oh, when a card was banished, it literally left the field. I remember watching episodes of Yu-Gi-Oh where Yugi would activate a card that would banish or remove a card from play, and he would literally put that card into his pocket. That does not happen anymore, because when a card is banished today, it might as well stick around. Dimension Fusion is basically a perfect case of exactly that. Dimension Fusion, at the cost of 2,000 life points, allows you to special summon as many banished cards as possible from your banished pile to your side of the field. Now, your opponent gets to summon their banished cards too, but that's assuming that they have a deck built around cards that are banished. And additionally, if you're going first, none of their cards are banished, so it's really irrelevant. This card would be absolutely broken in some modern decks, like, for example, Tri-Brigade. Can you imagine if Tri-Brigade could make an Appaloosa, activate Dimensional Fusion, and then make another Link 4 on top of that Appaloosa, and then banish all of those, and then have the Revolt set face down ready to go? Can you imagine if Phantom Knights used all of their banish effects, and right as you were about to end your turn, you activated Dimensional Fusion, summoned all of those Phantom Knights back, made an additional interruption, and now next turn they have 4 brand new Phantom Knights ready to go to set up their board all over and over again? The banish pile has essentially become a second graveyard and a second hand, and cards like this are absolutely considered the GOAT. Now, it's easy to consider also Return from the Different Dimension, which is a trap card, but the problem again is that it is on a trap card and not on a monster card, on a spell card. With a spell card, you can activate it and then immediately play with the cards that you special summon back. But with the trap card, you have to wait a turn, wait for your opponent's turn, then you activate it, and then you summon all of this stuff onto the board. So it's not quite as good. Dimensional Fusion is definitely considered one of the greatest cards of all time. Next up, we've got the original Crush card, Virus. Now, this card is incredibly broken. It's so broken they actually brought it back into the game, but they had to officially change the effect of the card. It couldn't be the original effect. The original effect of this card is you tribute 1 dark monster that's 1,000 or less attack, and then you destroy all monsters in your opponent's hand and field that are 1,500 or more attack, and for the next 3 turns You check every single one of their draws. This includes draw cards. So if they activate, for example, like a Pot of Greed or Graceful Charity, you get to check whatever they draw and for the next 3 draw phases. And every single card that they get that is 1500 or more attack automatically gets destroyed. It was absolutely a nightmare to play against this card. On top of that, this card was actually a prize card. So the players that were already really good were the only people that actually had access to this card. So it was a terrible situation where only the very best players in the game even had this card. And on top of that, they were already really good. And if you wanted to buy this card, I mean, it was thousands of dollars. It was outrageous to get this card. Eventually this card did get reprinted. It was still expensive, but it was just too strong to continue to be in the game. It's way too easy. All you need is a 1000 or less attack dark monster, and you basically win the game, because it's very difficult to play out of that hole. Every time your opponent tries to like draw or do anything, every one of their cards gets destroyed. Now there is a question as to whether this card would be as impactful today in today's metagame, just because destruction actually just triggers so many different effects, and cards getting sent to graveyard triggers so many different effects. We really don't know, because this type of card hasn't existed in such a long time, but I would say probably still the impact would remain. A lot of the card starters that you would need in your opening hand would just be destroyed, and yes, you could get them back in some ways, but it's still very minus when you get to destroy that many cards. It's still one of the most powerful cards to ever come out in this game. Now, lastly, we have the Card of Safe Return. Now, this card doesn't seem like much at the surface level, because you actually have to do additional things to make it good. But this card is actually insane, because what it allows you to do is every time a monster is special summoned from the graveyard, you get to draw a card. It is a continuous, non-once per turn effect. And like I've said before, Yu-Gi-Oh has become more and more about the graveyard, special summoning from the graveyard, banishing from the graveyard. It has become more graveyard focused than it has ever been. So this card would get you so much value in so many decks, where you could just special summon, draw, special summon, draw, and the more you draw, the more combo pieces you get, and the more you get to build an unstoppable, unbreakable board. This card is also good even going second, because you can just activate it and your opponent has to deal with it, because if they don't, you're going to be drawing cards over and over again. Also, this card is not once per turn. Even if your opponent did ash this card, it would only stop you from drawing once. You could keep drawing over and over again. It is one of the most broken cards of all time. Now, the next card on the list is a bit mysterious. It's technically not banned, but it is, by some, considered the most powerful card of all time. A man by the name of Kevin Tour once said that he owned a card that was so powerful that only he had it. It was never released. It is sitting somewhere in his house. If you're wondering who Kevin Tour is, he was the head of Konami. Back in 2005, he announced that he had this card called Millennium Eyes Virus. It was the most powerful card to ever exist. We don't know its effect. We don't know what it does. We don't know if it has a cost like every other virus. We don't know what the payoff of the card is. We just know that somewhere in this guy's house, this card exists. And this guy wouldn't lie, because he is the head of Konami. He's got this card somewhere, still probably in his house. It's never been revealed to the public. And for years, people have speculated about what this card does. Does it just automatically win you the duel? Does it just destroy all cards in your opponent's deck? Does it banish all cards in your opponent's deck? No one knows what this card actually does, but it is considered one of the most powerful cards to ever come out, although it didn't technically leave his house. This is easily up there in terms of the lost media / most powerful cards. Hopefully, by the end of this decade, we actually get to see what this card does and how powerful it actually is. Now, those are all of the cards that you should consider for the greatest cards of all time debate, or at least candidates that are very fitting of having that title. Now, the card that I personally think is the greatest card of all time is Painful Choice. This is a card that would virtually be played in every single deck. It doesn't matter if you're playing Eldritch. It doesn't matter if you're playing a going second OTK deck. It doesn't matter if you're playing a combo deck, a banish deck, a graveyard deck. It doesn't matter the type of deck that you are playing. This card would be good in all of them. And not only would it be good in all of them, in some decks it would be downright broken. Like literally, you draw it, you are guaranteed to win. That is how broken this card is in the modern game of Yu-Gi-Oh! It can truly never come back unless it has a very, very strong errata that says you can't use any of the effects. Now, it's possible that you disagree with me. If you disagree with me, or you feel like there's something that I left out, or you know the card that is the greatest card of all time, leave it in the comments section below. And I hope you've enjoyed this video. And again, thank you for watching.